Okay, everyone. Welcome to this final webinar on Revit template creation. This one is part 3. For those of you that have attended these, highly appreciate your attendance. I might be covering certain things in the beginning, which is an introduction to my company and what I do. But I'd also like to ask that if everyone could save their questions for the end, I would really appreciate that. And in addition to that, if you want to follow along using your Revit software, you should launch it now. So what is on the table for today? Take a look. Just a brief introduction of what Microdesk is and what we do. We started out as an AECO software consulting firm, and we've moved into more BIM operations. We have 13 locations in the United States and the United Kingdom. We have over 180 AECO consultant specialists dispersed all over the US and some in London. We are, an IBM business partner and an Autodesk Platinum partner. What we do, we offer many different returns on investments in building information modeling. We come into your office and help you enterprise strategy and workflow assessment. What that means is we analyze and then we produce an analysis for you on how to create better efficient workflows, on how to use new technologies, and how to move forward in terms of where the industry is. We also offer technology management and mentoring, which is what we're kind of doing today in the range of trainings, webinars, and value assessments. And then finally, we also create apps. We can create custom apps for your office, or we have apps that are currently available for you to purchase via the Autodesk app platform. So a little bit about me. I am an architectural consultant here. I deal a lot with emerging technologies. I'm very fluent in most of the BIM processes, from clash detection to Revit to Solibri. I am a Revit certified user. These days I do a lot of business intelligence and analytics for different companies on how they use their software and what ways they can sort of better their workflows in order to achieve a better return on investment. I have created standards and content creation. I've been in the industry for almost 10 years, and I am software agnostic. And my name is Gjergji, last name Shkurti. So what is on today's agenda? We're going to be talking about the Revit template, which we have been talking in the past. For today, though, I'd really like to get into the uncovered topics of how object styles work, how you can onboard a team through your legends, how you can create a view template that is tied to all your views and helps control how views are placed. We're going to open up a shared parameters text, and then we're going to go into, I think, the final sort of dimension of how deep you can reach in terms of your browser organization if you were going on an enterprise or a global office level. And finally, we'll get to work sets. I'm not going to cover these in this exact order. I'm possibly going to start with the global office-wide browser organization because I think that's one of the more important topics. And as I said before, you guys can go to our Microdesk channel to see the previous template videos, which are here. And why are we doing this? Well, first off, one reason why you built a Revit template is because you want to just be weeks ahead of all this redundant work that you have to do each time you start a project. Secondly, you add a graphic sensibility to how your office works and to how your projects look. You let the template guide staff if no one is available in person to help that staff be acclimated to your environment, or if they're new hires and they know somewhat a bit of Revit. If they look inside of the template and have that information available, it's much easier for them to reduce their errors. You can create a continuous loop on how views, view templates, and families connect, so you're really using the software to your ultimate advantage. And finally, you can globalize your growing business. So lately, as I've been discussing templates, I've noticed that there's a lot of, 1,000-person companies to 200-person companies, and each one has multiple different practice areas that they're trying to incorporate into one place. And I feel like the Revit template could be one of the tools to do that with. And then finally, we can create complex relationships between family parameters and project parameters, which is something that sort of gets lost in the complexity of tying things together, which kind of goes back to this previous point. Just keep in mind we've got a couple of more webinar events that we're going to be hosting. There's one on Enscape tips and tricks done by my colleague Tyler Putnam. That's on March 21st. And then there's also another one on Bluebeam 2019, which will be in April. Look out for those. And please save your questions for the end of this webinar, which I will leave a portion. Hopefully I can get everything in so we don't miss anything, and then I'll leave about 5 to 7 minutes for questions. Once again, this is where you can find the previous webinars, and we'll just get started. Oh, and I have one other thing to add. If you need to contact us, here is our contact information. I know a lot of you have been asking for a copy of the Revit template or some version of it, which I've had to distill down because some of this is proprietary. So you can reach out to our team, and they'll definitely get back to you. Okay, so for those of you that were in the previous webinars, to those of you that are new, I initially started with this template in my previous webinars, and I've just been developing it as we go. So some of you might remember this as my start page, which I won't talk too much about. I already spent much time on that. So the first place where I really want to get into is the general idea of how to really push your browser organization and what it means to do that. And so I'm going to go into, by right-clicking here, into my browser organization. So as you can see currently, and this is a typical way to organize a browser organization in terms of you have your working, presentation, and documentation views, and those work in tandem together. And I have in my previous webinars, I've also covered how the template works with the view templates to create filters. This is a standard technique which I think works well. You use working views to do your sort of initial designs, and you're constantly tweaking things out. So working views are personalized to each user. Presentation views obviously have a graphic character, and then documentation views are the ones that you place on your sheets. But this can be filtered out in multiple different ways. So I just wanted to show you the views that you're not seeing here that are actually available are done through a filter. So if I go to my browser organization, I have something here that's, my browser group for documentation, right? And this is strictly if I'm just doing on the architectural side, or let's say I was doing lighting design. Obviously, my naming convention for my views would be a little different. As I said in previous webinars, the numbers here help correlate to where you should place this on a sheet. But let me just give you guys an idea of how this is filtered out, because I've added a couple of new things to this to show you how you could become, let's say you've got 15 practice areas in your office, and healthcare does things a little different versus, residential. But you'd still like to include them all in the same Revit template. That way you could have a unified front on how you share one document that sort of unifies your office and helps really establish a standard. If we go in here in my views, I'm just going to go and edit this to show you how I've filtered this out so it looks like this currently. So one way that I've filtered this out is I've filtered it by discipline, and I've set this to architectural. Secondly, I've also created a parameter inside of my view template called view name, and I've added a practice area, meaning that if it's not a practice area, it's not going to show up. And then I've also added finally this one, which was in my previous webinars, how I was filtering out the model room. But now let's say I wanted to see everything in my browser organization that I actually have. So let me show you how that works. I'm just going to go to all, and I'm going to hit up. Wait, actually no, that's not the one I want. I'm going to go here to practice areas. And so as you can see, this is one way of, if you really wanted to. Now personally, I have no problem with 1 to 20 kind of different ways to coordinate your view types so that you know exactly what you're doing. But some teams don't want to see, you know, the coordination side or the MEP side, or maybe the MEP might want to go in and filter out all of these other view types. This is what I initially had, and this is me using my browser organization to filter these out. And so then you get to a certain point where one way you can filter out is via discipline, which if I hit apply here, you can do architectural coordination, electrical, mechanical, and structural. However, you're going to lose the initial sort of underlying structure of what I had set up, which was custom here in my, you know, 01, 02 and documentation. So if you wanted to strictly stick to just your practice areas, you're going to have to utilize the view template in order to help filter out your views. Why is this important? As I said, if your business is growing and continues to grow, it's better to have one itemized, and there are two schools of thought on this. Personally, I think it's possible. It's a little bit more difficult to do it in one Revit template versus creating a different Revit template for each practice area. And that's not including disciplines. So let me go back here and just show you guys once again when I hit apply here. Basically what's going on, and I did this really quickly just to show you, is that these are all set up correctly, but for coordination, all that's happening here is if I select this view, essentially I'm using the view template. If I go in here, I've got a coordination, and this is just an example for you guys, and I'm doing a 0.5 just to keep the sequence in order, so that coordination view gets placed under coordination. And then here you can get even more complicated, meaning you could have view templates for each type of view type. And this is where it gets, you know, the push and pull gets tricky. If you're really good at your naming convention and your organization, then you can create multiple view templates. However, it's up to a real BIM coordinator or project manager to help facilitate those for the staff. And as I said in previous webinars, view templates are a sacred piece of the Revit template itself, so they should not be tampered with. The only one that really you can play around with, as I mentioned before, is the working views, which, you know, are user-based and users can put their initials on. And what's interesting about these is that, is that nothing's included except for basically my filters. Everything else helps just place that view in the right location. And what that means is that instead of you going to the view template to change it, you're just hitting VV, you're hitting VV to go and make the changes you want, or you're updating it here in your properties bar. So that, I think that sort of ties in all of my previous webinar talks on why browser organization is important. But one other reason that's kind of being shown here that is not fully sort of fleshed out because I've added so many different subcategories is that in an ideal world, what you have here for documentation, you would essentially have, let's say for healthcare, you'd have all of your sheet naming conventions included in the view type, so that if you're working on a healthcare project, you would just filter that out and you would know exactly where to place it on your sheets. And you essentially do the same thing with views as you do on sheets. And just to show you guys what I mean by that, I'm just going to do a quick filter on to show you just what it would look like if I had just MEP, right? So you could do this, and you know that's all you want to look at. So that's the globalized sort of idea of what the browser organization can do for you. The second thing I want to talk about is how to actually make your views work correctly and how those views get tied to the view template so that when you create them, they go directly into the right subcategory. So let's say, just for fun, I wanted to create a view for, let's say, healthcare, right? And maybe I have a naming convention that I need. So first, what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to go into I'm just going to use my working floor plan here, level 1, which looks like this. And as you can see, this view type is named WKFP floor plan, right? That's just the view type. If I go to edit this type, you can see that in my type properties, there's my name, and then I am referencing the view template WKFP floor plan, which is already set up to basically place that view in the right location. But I need one for healthcare for my plans, for example. So what I'm going to do here, and you could do this with any of these, I'm just going to use the working. So I'm going to say, let's say I do H for healthcare, and then FP. And I'm going to do these capital because, as I said in previous webinars, if it's lowercase, the view never gets placed on a sheet. If it's capitalized, it does get placed on a sheet. So FP, and then I'm going to add level 1. Or excuse me, I'm just going to add floor plan. Okay, so I've got that set up. Now I need to basically coordinate the view type with my view template. So here I don't have a view template set up for my healthcare. So this is what I mean where this could get really large or really small depending on how you want to control it. But if you name it correctly, I don't see the problem. Or if you have the same type of view template that you want to apply to it, that can also work. I'm just going to create a new one, and just for our example, I'm going to call this floor plan. Let's call it FPH, and then I'm just going to leave it as is. Okay, so then here, instead of saying browser categories working, I'm going to pull that to healthcare. I'm going to leave the browser group as overall plans, which is my subcategory organizer. If I hit apply and OK, now I've got those two mapped. And basically, if I go to change the view template on this view type, let's say I duplicate this first, and then I change the view template to be that, it's going to automatically pull it down here, and maybe I should have just named these floor plans. But as you can see, and then the other thing I can do is if I didn't want to do it that way, I can go into just my views and say plan views, floor plan, and that view type is going to show up and place it in the right location. So I'm just showing you guys a further continuation of how you would continue to create, to tie in your view template with your view types in order to place them correctly. Now I'm going to move on to the part where I speak about how the Revit template can help organize your staff and how you can help facilitate onboarding. Now, I covered this a lot in my previous webinars, which I spent some time on legends. And as you can see, I have all of these legends here. I'd like to just reiterate that the lowercase legends are strictly there to inform on how to use the template. The uppercase legends have the ability to be placed on a sheet if you're going to do a printed set, or if that sheet's being delivered. Now, I have some other legends that I've created in another template that I just want to show you where you can go the next level of informing your staff on what to do. So let me just go to my other template, which is going to take me a bit to find. Let's do this. Okay. So as you can see here, I've got a work sets legend here and then how to use this template legend, which I think are super influential if you come in, you've got all this crazy stuff happening in terms of how your view templates are organized and coordinated, and then inside of those view templates you have filters, which I covered in my previous webinars. So one thing to look for, what I've set up here as how to use this template as a start, is an initial kind of description. Basically, I took screen captures and then I pasted them in, and then I start to explain how my browser organization is set up. And then I start to also explain, why all lowercase fonts are working and not to be placed on sheet. I also explain that all uppercase font names for views can be placed on sheets, and I start to go through all of these sort of unknown things that I described in my previous portion of this webinar that now is sort of documented inside of the Revit template through a legend. I also go in here and start talking about how filtering is going to work. So this becomes very, very useful when you get into a project and you don't know what you're doing, and you just need to look at something to help you kind of understand where your view types are going and how they're going there. Another thing that I think is very useful to set up is view templates. So when you're setting up your view templates, one way that I like to think about it, which I have helped sort of describe and explain in the previous webinars, is that I like to filter out the different annotation types, which you're going to have to, because if you don't filter them out, you're going to have overlaying annotations where you've got duplicates on top of each other. So something I like to do, if we zoom in here, in a working view template, I color code my working elevations and working sections so that when I see them in plan, via that color, I know directly that if it's, this cyan, it's a working elevation and a working section. I then also continue through my filters to turn off all of the other annotation styles, meaning I'm not going to see the duplicates in here of my, presentation set or my other sets, right? So as you continue building your browser organization, the more of these filters you're going to have to create. I'm strictly dealing with it here in terms of the three mains, which I still think are probably the best way to go and the most efficient. And if you were to go in that direction, then you would basically have to create a Revit template for each practice area, which I also think is perfectly fine because all practice areas tend to be different. So once again here, I basically did a filter establishing that my presentation elevations are going to show up in this red screaming out at you. And the reason that I make them red is because normally in presentation views, you turn off your annotations, right? And then I have some kind of signifier explaining, the difference. They're colored red so that you differentiate between the working and drawing set ones. And then finally, if we go to the drawing set ones, these are basically the views that are going to be placed on the sheets. They're standard black, and you have all your different annotation types sort of pointing at it, and then what they represent here. And then I'm not going to get into how I filtered this, but I'm filtering them basically through name and family type. So how do you get to this? This is strictly done through the view template in the filter category, and each view template has a filter, and this is where you go inside to open up this window, and then this window controls how your view looks. So two things here that normally are not common sense or even knowns when you start a project, that if you're just jumping in and this wasn't explained to you, you're not going to know why things are being hidden or where things went or if they were deleted or not. So that's one example of how a legend can inform your team and office. Another example is so in this project, I used the template a little differently. I basically employed the template inside, I opened it as a project. And by doing that, I can create a work sharing, right? And in order to have work sets, you need to have work sharing turned on. So this is pre-baked before you start so that lowercase, you got your link for architecture, you got your link for CAD, you got your link for CAD site, landscaping. So I keep all of these lowercase and I keep everything else uppercase so that if you were going to continue adding, core would be uppercase here, or if you're going to exterior fenestration, that would be uppercase. And what that means is that all uppercase work sets live inside of the live model, whereas all the lowercase work sets are linked in. And this is already giving you a head start, so how you know to continue. But to further sort of drive the point home, what you can do is you can create a legend which says, all right, this is how work sets work. And I know you guys might remember this from my previous webinar, but one way is you go in here and you start actually naming your work sets or how you think you're going to organize your project. And it's got everything pretty much ready for you. And then you can also, and this would be taking, the extra step, include everyone else's work sets so that you don't get confused when you're looking for stuff. It's just a nice way to notate it. And then there's some rules on how to think about it down here. And I just want everyone to know that work sets are really the primary organizer in terms of layering for work sharing models, whereas phases are like the next step after work sets. So there's no layers in Revit, but there is work sets. So then I go over here, and I've also created some presentation views on how to manage your work sets. So a lot of users are not familiar with this little button here, Work Sharing Display. Work Sharing Display is a very useful tool that project managers can use, and that is pre-built into Revit, and you can set up coordination views to check if things are on the correct work set. I go to a further sort of explanation, because normally you would have to click on this to open all of these things up, where I explain, what's owned by me has a color, what's owned by others has a color. This is a useful replacement for Work Sharing Monitor, which basically shows you owners. As we know, Work Sharing Monitor is being discontinued, so I highly recommend you use this tool. And then you've got model updates, and then finally you have a color coding for how all your work sets are color coded, right? So if you're looking at them in a 3D view, these colors help represent these work sets. And then also something else I want people to be familiar with: when opening a project, when you open a model, you're able to turn off the work sets you do not need on the first open. When you create a new local, you usually get this pop-up window where it says, do you want all of these open? If you hit yes, then it's going to take longer for your model to load. If you hit no on the ones you don't need, then your model will open a lot faster. And this is local to you as a user and not global to all the other users. Now, once that's done, and then you go in there and you start tampering with the work sets, turning things on and off again, that's when you start to turn other people's work sets off. So a simple little diagram like this is really helpful to, first, project managers, and secondly, to inform users on what's happening in the project. And then finally, if you really wanted to, which I highly recommend, and here I'm going to basically take a look at just like a 3D view. You could set up multiple 3D views, right? You basically duplicate them and continue them, and you can say, this is, in my case, I'm just going to say walls, work set, check, and then you can turn things on and off. And you name the work sets accordingly, and then here you just turn on your work sharing monitor on by clicking work sets, and it starts to color code your model. And so this is a way of having a nice little browser organization that you filter out and will help you coordinate how you're looking at that, at the different elements. So as we all know, if I were to change this to, let's say lighting, it's going to change color. If I were to change this to landscape, then you know that perhaps my walls are on the wrong work sets and I need to check my staff and what they're doing. But all of these things can be already you get a starting point in your Revit template, so you're not sitting there trying to do this stuff from scratch. So the next topic that I want to cover is a pretty heavy one. And let me just close all these windows, and I'm going to open this guy up again. The next topic is line weights. And if you can see here, I have all these line weights set up. And as from previous webinars that I've given, I've shown this example where I basically lay out all my line weights into legends so that I can view them, and then from here I can print them. In order to see the actual weight, I have to have thin lines turned off, and it shows me the weights. Just a quick sort of recap. These are the Revit out of the box. You can never delete these. These will continue to live in your project forever. These are line weights based off of Micron pens, which were built for this template, and essentially what they do is they're a close approximation of how microns work and how repetitiographs, if you were to draw with them. And then these are line patterns that also have a weight and have a different line style. Obviously, more can be built in here. It's not necessary. I think a smart way to think about it is to have about 8 basic line styles for solid lines, and then you can build these out as your office requires. So if I keep going, the scales change and you start to see the differentiation. But in order to explain what's happening here, I need to go through how the line styles, the actual thickness of this is set up. So, and this is something hard to comprehend. And also there's 2 schools of thought on this. In this project here, I'm going to show you 2 projects. The school of thought here was to unify the line weights and let the scale do the changing. So if I go into my additional settings and I go into my line weights, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but as you can see, there's a lot of numbers going on here. But if we look at them, let's say my 1 weight, if all across the board, it's set to 0.991. My 2 is exactly the same in my 3. So what I'm saying here, or when this was created, whoever created these line styles, that they're unified across the board under one thickness. So they're always, even if I pick 1, 2, or 3, they're going to show up at 1 thickness, and they're going to scale up or down at that thickness. And then if I move down to 4 through 16, you start to see a change. And the change here is that, you know, just a slight change in approximation to how Micron pens are, or a close approximation to it. But still, across the board, they're exactly the same line thickness. So what does this mean? I'm essentially saying that from 4 to 16, as the size, the real physical size changes, if it were going to print, I'm still keeping only 1 line weight rather than having a permutation. So I'm just letting the scale control that change across the board, meaning that it's just proportionally going to scale. And what that allows me to do is that from 4 to 16, which I believe that's what, 12 line weights or 13 line weights, those are the only line weights I have, and they just scale up. So that's one school of thought. Another school of thought on line weights is a school of thought which basically you take your line weights and you start to think about them per scale, and then you start to fine-tune them per scale. In this scenario, you create more permutations in terms of size. So as you can see here, we've got a 0.5 change here, and then it goes back to 0.35. So what that means is that the number 7 line weight has more than one scale style that is, so you're basically going in that scale making the change, whereas I said before in my previous project, it's just one size and the scale controls it. So this is like a second fine-tuning. And the better way to explain this, and you get pretty much similar results, is if I go back here to my other project, let me just close this, and I look at some of the line weights that they have here. They're basically adding more line thicknesses or more variation to their line weights. And how they do this, if we go and take a look at their line weight settings, you can see that they have changes happening. You know, at 1.5 inch to 1 foot, it's 0.5, but as I go to 1/4, it goes back down. So instead of having just 13, they have 13 times how many changes they've made, which depends on the scales that they have. So this, if you do this, then you have to be really careful in terms of keeping it up to date and also checking it. So there's been a lot of printing and back and forth in terms of checking how these look in this scenario. Both ways work. I don't have, I might have a bias towards one because I helped develop it versus the other. It's up to you depending on how clear you want to be or what kind of graphic standard you want to have. But that's not all in terms of line weights. So if I go back here, I'd also like to get a little bit into what this means for your object styles. So the one philosophy on object styles is that you've got all your different categories here from casework down to windows. And so I did this on purpose just to show you because I think this is more of an out-of-the-box example, which essentially shows everything down all the way down to 2, which really, if I go back to that that chart that I have, 2 and 1 are the same, so all my projection lines are going to be the same. I mean, I don't really want that, and I don't think that's a good standard. I just wanted to show you that this is usually left as is in a lot of templates and should be changed to depending on your office standard. But for example, I definitely want my doors to bump out or my casing details to bump out. So maybe I want those at something like, maybe 6 or 5. And then I can also start to, create a cut line variation on these. Now, this is, so as I was explaining work sets in terms of being the top layer hierarchy, your object styles are your top layer hierarchy. But your object styles can also be tinkered with in your view templates. So there's 2 schools of thought here. A lot of users who create Revit templates choose to ignore this, and they say, my holy grail is going to be inside of my template. So if I were to go into a floor plan, all my object styles are being controlled here, right? This is an overriding aspect of my view template. So users bypass the global object styles, which I think you should still take the time to set up so that you can see if you have, if you can get it to unify in one place, then you don't have to go through each template and make your manual changes on how you want to see it. I always think automation, solves a lot of problems and helps you get to what you're actually trying to do versus tinkering with turning things on and off. But this is the other way you would do it, where you'd go through each view template and then manually, and there are times when you might need to manually adjust your object styles. So I am also now, since we're past the view templates and also the line weights, I'm going to talk a little bit about shared parameters, which is, I'm not going to get to global parameters in this webinar, but I think shared parameters are much more stable than global parameters. For those of you that are not aware with what shared parameters are, they're a very smart way to help tag your project, help bring in parameters that already pre-exist that you're going to continue using. So the way that you do this is, I'm going to just give you guys a quick example using rooms. But you have, so right now I have my shared parameter file loaded. But first, I'm just going to show you where that shared parameter file lives. So the shared parameter file is usually also a sacred TXT file that gets saved in your standards folder, and then it gets copied into each BIM project folder. And by copying it into the BIM project folder, it's a very, basically what it looks like is something like this, right? It's just a TXT document. But it helps control, this organization helps control how those parameters get applied between families and projects. And so if you make changes to it on the project level, you're not really tampering with it on the office level. So I have this loaded in, and I just want to show you what that brings in for me. So all of these did not exist until I loaded that shared parameter file. So I've got shared parameter for rooms, And so these are all the parameters that I have available for rooms. Now, one thing that I want everyone to take into consideration, even though these are brought in, you still have to tie them in through the project. So let's talk about ceiling height, for example. So if I wanted to know my ceiling height in that room and I wanted to be able to schedule it, first I'm going to bring in my shared parameter file, and then I am going to also create it as a project parameter. So since I already got it here, I don't need to recreate this. All I needed to do here was load the shared parameter text. Now I'm going to go into my project parameters, and as you can see, I've got a whole lot of parameters in here that are, specific to my project. But the one that I am looking for is called ceiling height. And I'm just going to modify it to show you how. Actually, I'm going to remove it, and I'm going to recreate it. So once I do this, it's going to be a problem, and I'm going to have to recreate it. So let's add a parameter, and there's two ways to add one. You can go to your shared parameters, and all of this is going to be grayed out, and I'm going to hit select. And basically, it's going to open up that same dialog box, but as a way of loading it in. So I'm going to go to my rooms, I'm going to go to my ceiling height, and I'm going to load that in. And normally, if I'm not sure where I want to place it in terms of the group, I'm going to leave it, I usually leave it under identity data. Identity data is a great sort of fail-safe for if you're not sure where to place it. And then I'm going to take the ceiling height and apply it to rooms. So now I've tied all of these together, and I'm going to hit OK. And so now it's loaded into my project parameters. So I've got project parameter that is tied to a shared parameter. Okay, so now if I go to select this room here, you can see, well, I already had this ready, but over here now I have this ceiling height option where I can type in what my height is. And then I can start to quantify that and check that against myself. So you can do this with pretty much every category, obviously in different ways. But this is an example of how you would load in shared parameters. And then finally, let's say I wanted to tag that room with my ceiling height. I would go into over here, and I would go into my room tag, and there we are. So now, one thing I want everyone to be aware of, I already had this pre-baked, right, this little tag, which I'm calling family 1, but I should name it correctly as an annotation ceiling height tag. If I go in here, I also, in order for this to work this well, I have to create that annotation family. So if I go to edit my families, and these should really be pre-baked. If you have your shared parameters in your project, you should also pre-bake your families into it, as I've spoken in my previous webinars. Okay, so here we are. Let's just talk about this label for a little bit. If I go to edit label, you can see that this label is called ceiling height. And the way I created this, I'm just going to show you. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to delete it first, and I am going to also, I don't think I can delete it here. But let me recreate the same idea just to show you how this works. So in order to associate, what's really nice about a shared parameter file is that you can associate it into a project and into families. So if I hit select here, I can go back to rooms, go back to ceiling height, hit OK. It's already pre-baked for me. I don't have to do much here other than load it in, and it's in there, and then place it in here. Now I have two ceiling heights, but yeah, so you want to be careful not to load the same parameter twice, and you hit OK, and there we are. And then you take this and you obviously load it into your Revit template. So once you've got that, you can do that for pretty much all of your tags, and you can automate them through your shared parameters. It's a really nice way to think about it. And then if you really, which I'm not going to talk about because that's a whole nother topic, If you really wanted to just self-automate, then you would create a global parameter where the project knows that the shared parameter is being associated with it and automatically knows to tag it that way. So all this work that I'm doing once, I only do it once, and then through a global parameter, it ties all the different references together. I do have one thing to say about global parameters, which you can check out yourself. They are not as stable as shared parameters. Let's see, I believe I covered all the topics on the agenda. Yep. Onboarding, object styles, and we talked about work sets. So the whole point of this presentation is to really show you that, one, you can unify your thinking as an office and attack the different angles of how you're going to do your design. So it's more about allowing you to actually design or produce than to be thinking about the technicalities of how to, how am I going to fix this template? I have a deadline. When if it's already created and that template helps your view go to the right place and it's already filtered out, like in the examples I've shown before, where if I have my presentation views perfectly color balanced, and let's say I wanted everything to be a shade of gray with shadows on it, it's already ready to go. All I have to do is create the view. I don't have to go and tinker with it. Okay, so I am going to open it up to you guys for questions if you have any. And as I said, some of you might be like, whoa, this is like a roller coaster. We're just jumping into this. But some of the answers or questions you might be asking have been covered in the previous webinars. So let me just open up this question. Okay, we have one question. What is the purpose of having 1 to 3 same weight? So what you're talking about is this, if I understand you. For this scenario, we just wanted to reduce the amount of line weights available in this project template. So we just made 1 and 3 basically the same. Essentially, instead of having 16 line weights, we reduced it down to 14 line weights, where these 3 become 1. So how do I pull this out so I can see more questions? Give me 1 second. Oh, all right. Okay, so next question. Are there recordings of previous presentations? Yes, I mentioned that in my opening, which there are two YouTube recordings on our Microdesk channel. So there's one called Revit Template Part 1, and then there's another one called Revit Template Creation Part 2. You can find those on Microdesk channel/videos, or you can just type in Revit Template Creation, Basics of Template Creation Webinar, and type in Microdesk, and you should be able to find it. Can you group lines based on disciplines? Interesting question. I think if I understand, I'm assuming you're talking about 2D detailing instead of 3D, which I mean, you'd have to create a parameter for that, but for me, grouping is a very tricky process. Hold on, I just want to make sure that I can see these questions a little bigger. I think I need to stretch. There we go. But if you could add a little bit more to that that question, I might be able. Is this the standard Microdesk template? This is not the standard Microdesk template. This is a template that I have created specifically for these webinars using previous templates where I've I've asked for permission to use other templates I've created for different offices. But we might be able to give you guys a copy. If you talk to the marketing team, they should be able to give you some kind of copy of this template. So to the other question, to be able to filter out the lines. I'm trying to understand if what you're talking about, I'm not sure I'm getting it, but who's this, Tom? Hey Tom, if you want to send me an email after, and I'd be happy to discuss this with you. Maybe we can have a chat over the phone. This way we're not limited via, you asking the question and me trying to kind of guess as to what the question is. But I'd absolutely love to chat with you about it via phone call. And once again, I'm going to put our information, which is here on the screen. So you can reach out to team at Microdesk and your email will be forwarded to me appropriately. Do I have a list of acronyms how I made the FP for floor plan? I believe, Abraham, you're talking about the naming convention of, yeah. So that naming convention is something that I've come up with over the years. It doesn't have to be as complicated as mine. Essentially, what I like to do is I like to make it as redundant as possible so that the user doesn't have to second guess themselves as to what they're doing. So EL is short. I usually like to use 2 letters for elevation, FP for floor plans, RCP for reflected ceiling plans, and 3D for perspectives and isometrics. And I also like to divide them out so that you know what you're working on. If I move on to my presentation views, these views actually get placed on sheets, so they're going to be called the right thing, right? But so meaning floor plan 1. This is just a placeholder here. If I pull this out of how you should think about it, it wants you to know it's a presentation, but you're eventually going to rename it. Okay, floor plan 1 of this location. What's important is PR for presentation, FP for floor plan, and then floor plans. Which this is kind of redundant. You could get rid of the FP. I like to keep this here because it helps me organize how I think about my view template naming. That's the only reason. So I believe the question that you were asking me is, I basically have this template on how I made the acronyms. It's been sort of a growing process of, checking with staff, see if they like how the thing is named, and then eventually coming to some kind of basic or standard idea. And this is from multiple offices where I've created templates. Like I said, oh, and also just to add, I think it's important that, this is not the way or the truth of how you can do this. You can definitely set them up to your practice and how you want to name them. If I had to add anything, you should try to keep it as simple as possible so that you don't confuse anyone. For example, if I go into my documentation, this took me a long time to get to, but I had to create a 100 FP enlarged for enlarged floor plans, and I had to create a 100 FP for overall floor plans. I'm basically trying to have the naming convention run through the whole project, and so on. And obviously, this was for an interior design company, so the way that they were going to notate these are going to be very different from, let's say, I don't know, a healthcare architecture firm, where they have a lot many more different numbers that they need to notate correctly. And this is where I think offices get a little bit confused, where it's like one person knows exactly how it's organized versus the whole team. So I like to start with a template doing that for you. Well, I actually have talked about sheet browser organization in the previous templates. That's why I didn't cover it here. This browser organization is more like advanced topics, and I have covered this in my other templates as well. Sheet organization is essentially, if I go take a look here, I can show you. So in this scenario, I have my 100s to 800s, and I've got my presentation sheets essentially mimicking how my naming convention works here, so that if a user wants to place this on this sheet, it's not going to be a problem, and the sheet is ready, and all they have to do is look for the view that they need to place. The way these are organized, just to give you an idea, if I select this, I did two things. I used the sheet subcategory and the sheet category to locate it. And then you can go even further by, establishing a discipline if you wanted to filter it even more. And maybe I should express this one more time, but if we were to go to browser organization and we were to go to the different ways to filter something, you can see here that there's, I don't know how many, but it looks like 15 to 20 different ways of filtering something. So if you notate it in each type, then you can filter it correctly. Okay, I think that is 2 o'clock, a good hour of Revit templates. Thank you guys for joining us, and look forward to your attendance in future templates.